Good evening, everyone, and happy Mardi Gras. I'm Lori Hurwitz, the Associate Vice President of Alumni Relations, and I'm so happy you are all here joining us today for our second webinar in the Tulane Alumni Association's virtual Mardi Gras series. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few reminders for today's session. All viewers are muted, so we have the opportunity to hear our presenter clearly. That said, we do want to hear from you, so please enter any questions you might have in the Zoom's chat function, and we will get to that at the end of the presentation. This week, we are privileged to have Professor Tony Weiss with us. Professor Weiss is an alumna of the Graduate School and the Lawrence MVD Schloss Senior Professor of Practice in the Department of Economics, as well as the Executive Director of Tulane Center for Engaged Learning and Teaching. Her research focuses on economic development in the city of New Orleans, as well as in economic impact studies measuring the effects of a variety of special events that occur in and around the city, Mardi Gras chief among them. Professor Weiss, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're all looking forward to hearing more about your important research.
Thank you. Thank you so much for asking me to come and talk about Mardi Gras and talk about the economics of Mardi Gras. It is such an important topic because Mardi Gras brings in so much money for the city. So what I'd like to do is spend a little time talking about the economic impact studies that I have done, and hopefully this conversation will bring in a lot of questions. I really want to hear from those of you listening, hear what your questions are. So if we can get started, that would be great. I was first asked to do this study in 2007, and actually Paul Spent in the business school and I did the very first study in 2007 together. It had previously been done in before 2005, so before Hurricane Katrina. And then there had been many years when there was no study. I did one in 2007, and then every 2 or 3 years. And the last study that I did, and in fact, the last study that was done on the economic impact of New Orleans for the Mardi Gras, for the New Orleans economy, was in 2014. There are a number of ways that economic impact study can be done and different questions that can be answered. So we can see on the next slide the way that I approached it. I was really interested in 2 questions. I wanted to know what the aggregate economic activity was for New Orleans, and I really did just focus on Orleans Parish. So if you know anything about the political landscape in Louisiana isn't divided by counties. We have parishes, and a number of Louisiana parishes hold Mardi Gras, but I was really focused on just Orleans Parish. So I was interested in that economic activity, and I was also interested in the amount of tax revenues Mardi Gras brings into the city of New Orleans. Those 2 questions really go hand in hand. By first measuring the economic activity, then it's not too difficult to measure the tax revenue streams. Now, the question is, how do you measure that economic activity? So on the next slide, essentially, aggregate economic activity is GDP. So putting on my economics professor hat, there are 3 ways that you can measure GDP. You can measure that through the amount that is spent in a city. So you can add up all the expenditures. You could add up all the income that is generated from a certain activity, in this case, Mardi Gras. Or you can use what we call the value added approach, seeing as something is produced at each step of the way. In this case, because of the complexity of Mardi Gras, I decided to use the expenditure approach. So it was a matter of gathering the data of all the expenditures that we would say are related to Mardi Gras. But then we realized that there is this multiplier effect. And in case of Mardi Gras, it's really more of this brand value and that comes to New Orleans, and trying to get a measure of what that brand value is. And from there, then we could measure the tax revenue streams. So we set out to try, and you can see on the next slide, we set out to try and gather as much information as we can. If you think about what is being spent during Mardi Gras, well, first you have all the individual crews and the amount of spending that they do. And the spending that the crews do is not just in that 2-week or so period of Mardi Gras. They actually have activities and programs throughout the entire year. And for many of those large crews, Mardi Gras planning begins as soon as one Mardi Gras is over. They begin to plan for the next Mardi Gras. That expenditure, of course, ramps up as we get closer and closer to their parade. And on the day of their parade, there's still additional expenditures as the floats line up, all the catering and food, beverage, all of that is additional expenditures. Talking more about the crews, right? You have the expenditures of the individual crews, the individual clubs that spend money on behalf of that crew. So that is the membership dollars and what they're doing with those membership dollars. But then it's also all of the individual members. So we put out this survey to all of the crew captains, trying to get a measure of what each individual crew was spending, and if we could get a sense of what all of the members were spending as well. We also did a lot of vendor outreach to restaurants, grocery stores, bars, shops, clothing stores, jewelry stores, parking services, really anything that you could think might have some play in Mardi Gras expenditure. So all the artisans, all the costume designers, the whole industry around Mardi Gras. And of course, the tourist industry. And I think that's on the next slide. Is the tourist industry on the next slide? No, back up for a second, if you don't mind. Thank you. You know, Mardi Gras is this huge tourist city. And so all of the dollars that pour in during this Mardi Gras period also needed to be counted. Now, one of the mistakes that people tend to make when measuring an economic impact of a certain activity is to think that all expenditures during that time in the city are related to that activity. What do I mean by that? So if a person goes to the grocery store and they're buying up a bunch of food because they're having people over to watch a parade, well, those expenditures need to go to Mardi Gras. If people are going to the grocery store because they go to the grocery store every Tuesday anyway, or every Wednesday, and they're buying stuff that isn't Mardi Gras related, then you don't really want to count that. So what we want to find is kind of that marginal increase in expenditures. And the same is true for people coming into town. So if somebody comes into town for Mardi Gras, specifically to take part in Mardi Gras activities, then all of their expenditures while they're in town, we can count towards the economic impact of Mardi Gras. If they just happen to come into town during that 2 weeks, and oh, by the way, they participated in Mardi Gras, well, then you really can only take a fraction of their expenditures and relate that to Mardi Gras. So it's a matter of trying to find that incremental increase. Another complexity is that when people are spending money on Mardi Gras, and this is the local community, when they spend money on Mardi Gras, the the impulse is to count all of that expenditure as going towards Mardi Gras. But the reality is, if they weren't spending money, if they weren't spending dollars there, they might have been spending dollars somewhere else. There's this substitution effect that's happening. That was particularly obvious to me when I talked to like jewelry stores, because we know that Mardi Gras and Valentine's Day tend to fall close together, right? We just had Valentine's Day on Sunday. Mardi Gras is happening right now. And one of the things the jewelry stores note is that our Valentine's Day spending is significantly less than in other communities, because people don't spend for Valentine's Day, they're spending on Mardi Gras. While that you could take those dollars and think Mardi Gras, if you're thinking about the additional economic impact that Mardi Gras presents, if you took Mardi Gras away, those dollars would be spent in a different way. So again, it's this matter of finding that incremental increase and trying to eliminate the pull of that substitution, where dollars are spent in one place but could have been spent somewhere else. All right, with that in mind, if you don't mind going on to the next slide. So in trying to measure all of that expenditure, thinking about the marginal increase and thinking about those substitution effects, and bringing in the city's expenditure, because the city spent, and this is back in 2014, the city spent over $5.8 million on staging Mardi Gras, right? That's sanitation, that is recreation, that is the judicial system, that is, you know, all the barriers, all the spending, all the additional police presence, which was a huge budget item. So if we take all that additional spending and we add in the city expenditure, we came to a very conservative estimate of $164 million plus dollars that is GDP created, that's additional GDP because of Mardi Gras. But those are just those direct expenditures. And in economics, we talk a lot about a multiplier effect. The idea that if I spend dollars in a restaurant, then the owner of that restaurant is earning additional profit and the servers are earning income that they're going to go and spend somewhere else, right? And so the servers go and get their hair cut, and now the owner of that establishment has earned money and they can go and spend somewhere else. So dollars get multiplied throughout the economy. We call those indirect expenditures. In the case of Mardi Gras, we found it a little difficult to think about just that multiplier effect, and found it easier to think about this brand value. Like, what does Mardi Gras bring to New Orleans? And I started to think about, right, if you are in the quarter in July and it's not COVID, and then there's tourists around, there are a lot of people wearing Mardi Gras beads. Now, those of us who are local, we know it's not Mardi Gras, and we might even kind of look at them and go, oh, it's not Mardi Gras. But in what Mardi Gras does is bring people into town because of the ambiance that Mardi Gras creates. And so when you see tourists any other time of year wearing Mardi Gras beads, that's Mardi Gras. And that expenditure should be counted in the economic impact of Mardi Gras. Additionally, when conferences come to town, regardless of the time of year, you know, we have these big doctors' conventions and conferences, often they have, as part of the entertainment for the people attending, they have mini Mardi Gras parades where they, Blaine Kern's organization will bring out floats, and they'll go from, say, their hotel down to the convention center, and they'll have this little Mardi Gras parade. Well, all that expenditure also needs to be counted in Mardi Gras, because it is what Mardi Gras is bringing to the city. If you go into any New Orleans themed restaurant across the country, I would say across the world, because Mardi Gras food, I mean, not Mardi Gras food, New Orleans food, New Orleans culture is kind of international. But if you go into any restaurant, it will be decorated, you know, purple, green, and gold. There will be beads, there will be masks. That is Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras is one of the oldest cultural events that is still continuing in New Orleans, and has created this culture of festivals. So now we have so many festivals here in New Orleans, but Mardi Gras really is the very first one that we had that is still ongoing. So with that in mind, if I could see the next slide, we kind of had this brand value, and we tried to be really very conservative of just under one, a multiple of 1 to just over 2, and therefore multiplied this direct expenditure, creating this high and low franchise value that as a result of Mardi Gras. And then again, to be conservative, we really just took an average of those two values, giving us an overall aggregate economic impact of $465 million. That is what Mardi Gras brings to the city. Now, I want to say that I think this number is really conservative. Prior to me doing this impact study, as I said, there was a study that was done prior to 2005. I think it was maybe 2003, 2004. And that researcher found economic impact of $1 billion. So over twice this amount. And that is the number that was passed around for years. In fact, I think you can still see that number in different Mardi Gras related publications, a $1 billion economic impact. I know where that number came from. I tried to find the research on that number and was unable to do so, but it seemed really out of line, particularly at that time. When you look at the yearly GDP for New Orleans, $1 billion really did not seem possible at all. So I think this number is really pretty conservative. And again, comes from 2014. If you've heard that $1 billion number, I think at least at that time, it was kind of high. All right, so we take this overall impact. If I can see the next slide. From there, we can look at the tax revenues that are flowing into the. And these tax revenues are really very important, because each of the crews, when they parade, they pay a really pretty small, like, I think it's what it is now, I'm not sure. At the time, I think it was about $175 fee to parade. And I know a lot of people feel like they should be taxed more, and that the fee to parade should be significantly higher. And the argument that I was trying to make was, Mardi Gras brings in so much money to the city. And if you remember, their direct expenses were in the $5.8 million range. So just looking at just the direct expenditures and the tax revenues coming in of 9.2 million, the city makes money. And I'm not talking about the city economic impact. I'm talking about the city government makes money on Mardi Gras and just those direct expenditures. If you bring in the incremental and brand value, the city government is bringing in, again, 2014, $17.5 million of tax revenues for 5.8 expenditure. So that is an incredible return on their investment for the outlays that they put forward during the Mardi Gras season. The next slide. Yeah, so I included this slide. I realize that a number of you are locals, and so you're very aware about the house floats that have been happening. And on all of these slides, there were pictures from different house floats that are going on. This is a map that was created January 30th, so just a couple weeks ago, all of the house floats that have started. So this is kind of interesting, right? We're not having Mardi Gras. We're not having the big parades. That means a lot of artisans were out of work. And so people began to, I think it started with the idea, let's hire some of these artists. And then people got more and more involved and began to do a lot of the work themselves. But we can't just let Mardi Gras go because of COVID. We can't just ignore it. And so in typical New Orleans style, people began to decorate their homes, some more modestly, some much more elaborately. And this is a map that was created to show all of the different house floats. And I know that since January 30th to now, that the number has increased significantly. Hopefully the expenditures on that helps a little bit, because this is pretty devastating for the city to not have Mardi Gras and the dollars that it brings in. And I think that's my last slide. Yep, absolutely. So I hope that generated some questions, because I'm here to answer.
Great, that was awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. So Tony, we have a couple questions to get started. So I actually drove around the city just this afternoon to see some of those house floats. How do you think the tradition will grow and evolve? Does this sort of spending, do you think, will compete with existing traditions? Or does it sort of grow the pie, per se, or the king cake, if you will, and lead to further investment that this will be something that'll continue?
So I think this year is really interesting. I mean, if you remember, one of the things I said was it's, you know, when we think of the economic impact, we kind of think of the counterfactual, right? If Mardi Gras didn't exist, what would the expenditures be? So this is a perfect year to see that. We're not having Mardi Gras in the traditional way. So how do we see those expenditures? And I think it's so interesting to see how much people are still getting into the spirit and spending dollars decorating their houses. And I can't know for sure, but my guess will be that this is now going to be a new tradition, that people are going to, people who don't want to go to parades in the, you know, the crowdedness of the crowds, but if people are decorating their homes all over the city, it gives people another avenue to enjoy the festivities and enjoy the culture and enjoy the art by visiting homes and going on kind of these home tours around the city, and avoid maybe some of those big parade routes. So I think it will continue, because I think it gives people a whole additional way to celebrate the season.
Excellent. So we had a question come in through the chat. If you were able to isolate a dollar amount spent on throws annually by the crews.
So we did have that number. We in the surveys, we did get the number of throws, but remember, those throws aren't made in New Orleans. And so if we, by spending, you know, here's an example. If I spend $100 on throws, but $85 of the value of that throw was somewhere else, and a lot of them come in from overseas, then you can really only take that $15 that was the additional overhead and profit of where I bought those throws. So I actually do it deep down in my research. I have that number that is spent by both crews and individual members on the throws, but you can't take that whole number and add it into your economic impact.
So another question, which sector of the New Orleans market do you think will have a harder time recovering from COVID? Either the business side or the conference travel and leisure side?
Probably the business conference travel, just because, as we've all seen, we can get a lot of business done by not traveling. On the flip side, you miss out on a lot of those casual conversations, and in those casual conversations, people learn a lot, right? So you have a big conference that comes to town and they go to their different sessions, but often some of the real work and some of the most creative work is being done around the lunch table or over the coffee container. So I think to eliminate that completely would be to businesses' detriment, but I do think that that might take a little bit longer to ramp up. I think people are desperate to start traveling, and I think that will probably come back sooner.
I think I agree with you. So several times in the past, the commercialization of Mardi Gras has come up as a solution to lost revenue, but it's also faced some fierce cultural resistance. Can you talk a little bit about what commercialization is and if you think that would be a factor moving forward, particularly as we're sort of needing to make up for some lost revenue this year?
Yeah, so commercialization would be sponsors, right? We would have, just like we have the Super Bowl, right? What is it now? Is it still the Mercedes-Benz Super Bowl?
I think it depends. It's a Mercedes-Benz Superdome. I think it depends on where it is.
Right. The Superdome, that's what I meant. The Superdome, right. So that means that these different crews would have corporate sponsors, and even Mardi Gras as a whole might have a corporate sponsor. I don't think looking at those numbers and looking at the tax revenues that come in, I don't see its value. And I don't think that the city would ever really want to see that, just because there's a purity to Mardi Gras that it doesn't have corporate sponsors. And so somebody would have to make a really good economic appeal to why that is needed, right? The city in a good year already makes a lot of money on Mardi Gras. And there is a point of saying, is it worth making even more money by having these corporate sponsors, but reducing what Mardi Gras is? And so I have a hard time seeing that happening. I just think there would be way too much pushback from the local community to see that happen.
Let's keep talking about the city for a second. Oil and space industry in the 80s was really thought to be the future of economic engines of New Orleans. But I think nearly 40 years later, we sort of see that tourism and hospitality, continue to dominate. Do you think city leaders need to lean further into that trend, or are there other potential industries that they should be actively cultivating at this point?
Yeah, I hate to see a city that's so reliant on tourism for a lot of reasons. One, let's look at what's happened, right? With COVID, people can't travel, and the amount of money that is flowing into City Hall has plummeted dramatically because we haven't had the tourist industry. But also, tourism generates really pretty low wage jobs. The service industry as a whole are pretty low wage jobs. And so, and the educational level of the workforce that we want to attract is difficult. So I really think that New Orleans has been and needs to lean in much more into those industries that create higher paying jobs. Bringing up the overall wealth of the community. It can only help everybody.
So we had a great question that just came into the chat. I think, we probably both know, and we'll soon start to hear that Tulane is leaning more into the entrepreneurship area, and it's an area that New Orleans wants to get into. Have you heard any efforts by local entrepreneurs to make biodegradable throws, which would keep more money in the local area if manufacturing is done here? I see a potential business here.
Yes, I have not heard that at all, but yeah, that would be amazing. There's the old joke that locals hear is that people's houses, the foundations have to be stronger because we all have 50 pounds of throws in our, in our houses, and the amount of trash. They cleaned out the drainage systems in New Orleans, how many millions of pounds of throws? I mean, it was just astronomical. And so the waste of these throws is really pretty substantial. So yeah, I mean, biodegradable, that would be pretty amazing. And you develop it here, then that's all pure money for New Orleans. So I think that would be amazing.
Yeah. So I have been reading that many and know as I try to schedule homecoming for next fall that most of the major festivals in the city are making plans for 2021 postponements. Assuming that will work from a public health perspective, how much catching up is possible from an economic perspective given this strategy?
I don't know. I mean, I think our spring festival season is already really packed. And our fall had started to get a little bit more packed too. You have Voodoo, you have I don't know, there's some music festivals that my kids you'd go to, whose names are escaping me. So fall was already was getting crowded. Could be a point at which the dollars are just kind of running on top of each other. And then what do you do in the spring? Right. So if you have, for instance, Jazz Fest. So Jazz Fest, I heard, was being planned for October. Well, then is it going to be also again the following April, May? I'm not entirely sure how that catch up is going to work.
We shall see, I suppose. So we've had a couple questions about sort of the scope of your study. So one person asked, is it known what percentage or dollar amount Tulane University and its affiliates contribute to Mardi Gras revenue in the economy? So just looking at the institutional impact.
That is actually a really good question. It's not something that I looked at all. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's certainly something, like I said, the last time this study was done is 2014, and it absolutely should be done again. But there hasn't been any money behind it. And I think that's a shame. I'd love to see the city, and I'd love to see the Convention Bureau and tourist industry, the Tourism Bureau. I would love to see them throw some really serious money at this, because I kind of working on my own, I was able to do a little bit. With some more resources, we could really dig in more. We also can't forget, right, that there is a cost, right? There's a huge loss of productivity that happens around Mardi Gras. And I feel like that amount of that loss, that cost of having Mardi Gras needs to be included in the study as well, to kind of wrap our heads around it, right? When the CBD needs to close down at 3 every day of the Mardi Gras season, that's a loss. Now that'll be less now that we all know that we can Zoom and teleconference. People can go home and continue working at home, but I do think that loss is something that we need to measure.
Well, let's talk about the profit for a minute. Where does the city's profit from Mardi Gras go? And has the city designated any particular efforts for that revenue that you are aware of?
So when we talk about profit, do you mean like the dollars that are flowing into the city? They're just part of their general operating budget. I mean, it goes to RTA, and it goes to the school board, kind of that general ledger of when dollars come in, when our sales taxes, they're kind of pre-assigned. And so those dollars are already pre-assigned, and they're budgeted into the city's budget, and they're just part of the general operating budget.
Which makes this year even more important to think about, right?
Right.
So this question just came in, sort of backing up a little bit. Do you think there is a dearth of venture capital in New Orleans? And assuming that's an issue, what can the city and Tulane do to attract more venture dollars to drive innovation and high wage job growth in New Orleans?
So really out of my area of expertise. I don't, I hate to kind of jump in where I don't know. Yes, I think we need to do more. We need to do more to bring high wage jobs to New Orleans. That is an absolutely true. We need jobs that are more sustainable in down times. We want jobs that are more recession proof. We absolutely need to do that. How we do that, you have to attack it on a whole lot of different levels, right? We have to have the housing, we have to have the quality education to bring people and attract people to New Orleans. We also need to have the industries that are willing to locate here. So the tax structures that are enticing for business.
Agreed. So there's been a couple questions about your next economic impact study, and a few questions about that. So the last one you did in 2014 was before that big story about the beads in the storm drain and the removal of that. Was that money accounted for, or will be figured into your next impact study? And when do you plan on doing that?
I mean, I don't have there's nothing in the pipeline. Like I said, I got to a point where I just felt like I was not doing the study justice, that I didn't feel like the quality of the work that I was producing was what I was comfortable with. And a lot of that was because of the amount of resources that were put towards the study. It's a lot of work. The crunching of the numbers is not that difficult. It's the data gathering that is really huge. And so it takes a lot of boots on the ground. It takes a lot of convincing. People don't want to just hand over their revenue numbers to a researcher so that you can get those dollars. And it's not just their revenue numbers during Mardi Gras. You need to see kind of the revenues they're making throughout the year so you can see that incremental changes. And people don't want to just hand over those dollars. And so it takes a lot to try and get people convinced to do that. And I did not have as much time as I would have liked. So there is no study planned that I know of coming out, which is a shame.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
So what's next? We're coming out of COVID, and what are your predictions for the long-term impact of this pandemic on Mardi Gras and what we can expect to see?
I think it's because, and I've said this a lot to my students in terms of the economy, though the longer this goes on, the more difficult it is. But the economy was not fundamentally broken before COVID, right? And so if we can get people vaccinated, if we can get this pandemic under control, we have no reason to believe that we can't quickly get back to where we were. That being said, over these last 11, almost 12 months now, we have had a tremendous amount of businesses that have gone out of business, which is just tragic. And if we had been able to get this pandemic under control in a much sooner period of time, I think we would have seen a much faster recovery. In terms of tourist dollars, I think those are going to come back, right? We have the infrastructure for it. Nothing happened to the infrastructure. We have the hotels, we have the space to have people. So I think from a tourist perspective, people we're going to see fast recovery.
That's great. I will say I've been reading a lot from a king cake perspective. I hear the bakeries are quite happy as well. They were a little worried and have been doing very well over the season. So people have not stopped buying their king cakes. So I hope you have an opportunity to enjoy one.
Right. And that's one of those things, right? That it doesn't require a crowd to take part in.
Yes, our waistlines have been able to tell the difference, that we're keeping them at home instead of at the office. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Professor Weiss, and for this wonderful talk. I think we're just about out of time, but best wishes to everyone from the Tulane Alumni Association for a safe and happy Mardi Gras tomorrow. As a reminder to our audience, you can learn more about future events like this, and as well as enjoy past content on our website, alumni.tulane.edu. Thank you all for joining us. And once again, happy Mardi Gras.
Thank you.